I don't know quite where to begin. It has been a 10 or 11 days unlike any in my life, unlike any in my rabbinate. I am physically and emotionally as spent as I have ever been. And I share that with you. So if you feel that way, you are not alone. What I would like to do, I realize some of this may be maybe repetition, but I want to share some of the remarks that I shared with Bethel, with our congregation last Shabbat. I want to add a little bit about my experiences over the past week or so and give us some things to think about as Jews. I know there are people here who are not Jewish, as Jewish adjacent, as human beings walking through the world. And then I want to take some questions and invite you to share with me your experience of the past 10 days. The one thing which I will say about that last part is I want to emphasize that this is not a space where I want people to be engaging in political conversations with each other. You may do that individually afterward, but here I just would like to hear either your experiences and also your questions for me. And if I feel like your question is something that'll be helpful for the group, then I will be happy to talk about it further. And if it's more individual, I'll invite you to find me at a different time. Okay? Does that sound like a plan? Donna, when did we go 12 to 1 or 1:30? I can't remember. 1:30. Okay. All right. So I can take a deep breath a little bit. So in terms of my remarks last Shabbat, I just actually finished my chavruta. I have a friend named Shalom Goldman. He used to be at Bethel. He was a professor at Duke, before that at Emory. He's now at Middlebury College, where his wife, Lori Patton, is the president of Middlebury. He and I have had we've been studying the Torah together for many years, and we decided to switch commentators. We were studying someone named Rabbi Shlomo Ephraim Lunchitz, who was the chief rabbi of Prague in the early 17th century. We're now studying Isaac Abarbanel. Isaac Abarbanel came from a very illustrious Spanish Jewish family. He fled to Portugal. He was a philosopher, a financier. He was a advisor to kings and queens. He fled Spain after its Inquisition in 1492 and died in Venice in the early 1500s. And as we studied his Torah portion last week, we studied the passage about the snake. And Barbanel comes from a line of Spanish medieval rationalists who probably have a lot in common with people who like a more rational, scientific approach to the Torah. And he didn't like the idea of talking snakes, because I don't know about you, but I haven't seen talking snakes. And he said, the Torah has a way of telling us when animals talk miraculously. There's a scene, if you remember, there's a guy named Bilam and Balak in the book of Numbers, and And in the book of Numbers, it says, Vayiftach Adonai et pi ha'aton, which means the donkey opened God opened the donkey's mouth. Okay? And so you're being told that this was a miracle, the donkey spoke. Okay? It doesn't happen very much. But here it doesn't say anything about that. And what Abarbanel says is that the snake didn't actually speak. What was happening is the snake was, trying to get Eve interested in the tree and to tell her, ooh, it's very yummy and you can eat from this tree. And so what did it do? It was like a beauty pageant, right? The snake would slither up and down the tree, right? And by its actions, it created within Eve an internal dialogue. And that when the Torah records for you that the snake is speaking, it's recording for you what Eve heard the snake saying to her as she observed its actions. And what I want to do is to use that as a frame for thinking about the internal dialogue that the Jewish community, and I would say, obviously not everyone, but that many, many Jews around the world have experienced based upon what they saw unfold on October 7th. And the first thing that it's important to understand is that when we saw, and as we have continued to see, babies beheaded and women raped, and the random execution, purposeful execution of innocents, and the kidnapping of children and the elderly and people with special needs. Jews saw those things and experienced them through our historical, and we had a word for it, pogrom. We know about pogroms. Most of the Jews in the United States are here because we were fleeing pogroms. A lot of us because we were fleeing pogroms in a place called Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania. A pogrom was when sometimes they would happen around Easter. People would leave churches angry that Jews were Christ killers, and they would go, and sometimes it was at different times of year, somebody was accused of something, whatever it was, and the entire community would set upon Jews and would rape Jewish women and kill Jews indiscriminately. And part of what made a pogrom is that the Jews went to the police or whatever authority was there at the time. And when we said help, either the police actually joined in the pogrom or turned a blind eye and said, we're not getting involved. And Jews experienced a sense of both powerlessness and also betrayal, because they experienced their neighbors turning against them. And thinkers in Israel have gone as far as to say that for 24 hours last week, and not last week, but for 24 hours on October 7th and stretching into October 8th, the state of Israel ceased to exist in a significant part of its geography. That's significant. I'm going to read you a text that I got from one of my former campers, who is now a mother of three and an executive of an Israeli startup company. She lives in Jerusalem. And she wrote to me about the experiences of October 7th. It's a failure of the whole idea of Israel. I can't wrap my head around Shoah, Holocaust level atrocities inside Israel proper. This is why we have Israel, no more pogroms. And how will we get up from the grief? And so one thing to understand is that as Jews and Israelis saw that unfold, they had a name for it. It was called a pogrom. And fundamentally, what it whispered into each of our ears was Jews are not safe. Not in Israel, but also not anywhere. Because the state of Israel was founded for many reasons, but one of them was to be a refuge. One of them was to say, no more pogroms. Jews will be able to defend ourselves and keep ourselves safe from that sort of violence. And so it was not only Israelis who are now shaken, because one of the very purposes of the country was undermined beneath their feet, but also many Jews who have chosen to live outside of Israel and yet feel a sense of safety and security from the existence of the state of Israel, and now feel a sense of being unsafe existentially. A second thing that we saw was, even while bodies were still being recovered before funerals had taken place, which, by the way, is still happening. There's an Israeli woman in our community who has a best friend in Israel whose daughter has autism. They were praying that she was kidnapped. And she found out yesterday that she'd been killed, murdered. They found her body. I don't know whether it was a small kindness that an autistic girl was not in captivity in Gaza, but was spared that. But before the funerals were done, we watched, our kids saw on the internet memes and statements, and we saw a demonstration here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where the Students for Justice in Palestine said, we are morally obligated to be in solidarity with Hamas, because Israel is a colonialist state, and nobody ever escaped oppressors by not using violence. And so we are morally obligated to be in solidarity with the violence that took place. And we watched that. By the way, they issued a flyer which had an illustration of a paraglider in case there was any doubt. This was not solidarity with the Palestinian people. This was solidarity with Hamas, and it was solidarity particularly with specifically the actions that they took, which was the beheading of children, et cetera, et cetera. And Jews saw those things and said, nobody understands us. And nobody cares. And the nobody cares we saw because it took convincing and process and time to get university presidents to issue condemnations because they were wary about wading into politics. This was, for many Jews, the both sides moment of Trump after Charlottesville. But it wasn't the president of the United States, it was presidents of universities, it was people who run institutions that exist for the purpose of education, not being able to find a moral compass to say Hamas is evil. And I want you to know, by the way, that in England, which has, I think, a pretty good record for free speech, expressions in support of Hamas are illegal, as are expressions in support of ISIS. And not only does the United States and universities permit that speech, which we live in I'm grateful for free speech, but university presidents couldn't find the moral compass to use their own free speech to say, these people on our campuses are wrong. And Jews said, nobody understands us because we watched painfully and listened painfully for people to speak up. And we heard gibberish and silence. And we also said, nobody understands us because I want to be very clear that I understand, and you can make some arguments and you can find sometimes in Zionist literature itself that speak about Israel and colonialism. I get it. And yet there's something fundamental that needs to be said, which is that Jews do not see themselves as colonialists in the land of Israel. The land of Israel is where the Jewish story started from the very beginnings of the Bible. And it's where it continued. It's where Jewish history unfolded during the time of the Judges and through the destruction of the temple by the Romans. And after that, there was always a small Jewish presence in the land of Israel. You know why it was small? Because a lot of Jews weren't allowed to go and live there. So we're kept from our home because of oppression, and then because we were oppressed, people say it's not really your home. But there's always been a small Jewish presence in the land of Israel. You can go throughout Europe and you can see synagogues where there are no more Jews there anymore because they expelled their Jews. But you can go to Spain and Portugal and see a tzedakah box, a synagogue with two tzedakah boxes, two charity boxes, one collecting money for the local Jewish community, and the second one collecting money for the Jews in the land of Israel. And it wasn't symbolic. They were collecting funds and sending them to support the Jews who lived in the land of Israel. And when the Spanish Inquisition took place in 1492, as I mentioned, in studying Isaac Barbanel, he fled to Italy. There was a whole group of people, of Kabbalists, of Jewish mystics who went to Tzfat. And they lived there, and they've lived there for the past 500 years. And there was an ancient Jewish community of Hebron that was massacred in 1929, long before political Zionism. But these were Jews, and this is where the Jewish story unfolded. And we see the land of Israel not just as a refuge, but as our home. Now, I'm an American Jew. I want you to know something. I feel my father fought in World War II, my grandfather in World War I. This is my home, but I can have two homes. When I go to my brother's house, his son is having a bar mitzvah, not this Shabbos, but next Shabbat. When I go to my brother's house, I'm going to walk into my brother's house and I will feel at home because he's my brother. And when I go to my mom's house, I feel at home because she's my mom. And anywhere your mom is home. And when I go to Israel, I feel at home. And the land of Israel and the establishment of the state of Israel gave Jews a place to feel at home. And so the whole charge of colonialism, we watched it. We felt a sense of, I'm not safe. Nobody understands me. And nobody understands the Jewish story. And I'll say one other thing. It's an important story. And I have to get the dates here, but it was in one of the early Zionist congresses, there was in the late 1800s or I think it was the early 1900s, there was something floated called the Uganda Plan. And the Uganda Plan, if you want to talk about colonialism, okay, by the way, the other reason that colonialism doesn't fit is that the way that colonies work is that there's a mother country. America was a colony, and the British taxed us, and we said, you all know the story. We sent back our raw materials to the mother country. England had lots of colonies. It had the United States. It had, by the way, it has the Middle East at some point, right? From First World War until 1948, British Mandate Palestine was a colony. India was a colony. It was serving the motherland of England, and France was a colonial power. North Africa, Lebanon, they speak French in Lebanon. You think they spoke French in Lebanon before France? No, it was a colony. Ask yourself, what's the mother country of the Jews? What's the mother country the Jews in Israel are sending back to? And you hear it because people will say, well, the Jews in Israel should just go where? We've now had suggestions, by the way, floated, they should go to Israel. Excuse me, they should go to America. That's what some of the people said. They should just go to America. Or they should go back to Europe. I tell you this, so what's the story? The Uganda Plan was Jews you should make a home in Uganda, okay? Because there's nothing in Uganda. That was the thought. And you know who said no? There had just taken place the Kishinev massacres. The Kishinev pogroms. And if you want to read a poem about them, I commend to you a poem called The City of Slaughter that was written by Bialik. And they were terrible pogroms, and this idea, and it was in Ukraine, and this idea came up, and the people who said no the loudest were the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian Jews said, other people were saying, Israel needs a refuge. The Jewish people need a place just where we can't get killed. Let's take the Uganda Plan. And the Ukrainians, who were the ones who needed the refuge the most, they said, no, our home isn't in Uganda. Our home is in Israel. That's where our home is. We can't build a state just to be a refuge. What else did we see? Hold on for 1 second. Sometimes the rabbi has to look at his notes. Oh, no, not that one. Hold on, that's something different. You'll see that when that comes out. I get in trouble. There's a third thing. It's good. It's worth it. Oh no, this is the wrong thing. Okay, all right, no worries. I'll do it without. Let me go back here. Is that right? Okay. So we looked at these things and we had a sense of not being safe, of being misunderstood. And we also looked out at the world. And part of what happened on Shabbat at Bethel is that for whatever reason, I decided that I really just wanted to invite some of our interfaith partners and friends. The Imam Abdullah Zeppeli came, Katie Crow from Trinity Avenue Presbyterian Church, Mindy Douglas and Esther Hethcox from First Presbyterian, Imam Abdul Wahid. These are people who I know and love. Brad Kramer, who's a local Mormon who studies with us. And what I realized was it wasn't just that I needed to see their faces, but what I needed very desperately was to see them seeing us. It is such a deep human need for people to be seen and known in their fullness. And there is, I think, another strange book I'll recommend to you. If you haven't heard of it, it's called it's a strange title, People Love Dead Jews. It's by Dara Horn. And she opens with an anecdote about a young man who is Jewish and he gets a job working at the Anne Frank Museum. And he wears a kippah. And the staff of the Anne Frank Museum said to him, "You can't wear a kippah." And he said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, we want to keep this as a neutral space." And he protested, and it took the board of the Anne Frank Museum 3 months, if I can put this the way that Dara Horn does. It took the board of the Anne Frank Museum 3 months to finally say yes, so that a Jew could work at the Anne Frank Museum and not be in hiding. Because the Anne Frank story is beloved as long as the lessons that you learn from it are lessons of love and universalism. And she says that people forget that the end of Anne Frank's story was that she was murdered for being a Jew. And Jews right now, and so there has been, for all of that, there has been a lot of sympathy for Israel and for Jews and for the terrible things that have happened. But many Jews are waiting, and it's already started to happen, for that sympathy to run out, for people to be calling for a ceasefire, which I believe is morally repugnant and problematic right now. And I say that as somebody who wants peace and believes in peace, and I don't think that that's the way to get peace. And that part of the reason that people will grow uncomfortable is Israel wages a war in which many civilians are going to die. Israel will never as a policy, it's not to say mistakes don't happen, but never as a policy will Israel purposefully target civilians. But the challenge that Israel faces is, how do we fight an immoral enemy without becoming immoral? We are fighting an enemy who has used hundreds of millions of dollars to construct, some estimates are 300 miles in a 25 mile by 6 mile wide strip of land, 300 miles of underground tunnels. with electricity, with air conditioning, with water, to purchase weapons, hundreds of millions of dollars, instead of building a society, instead of building bomb shelters for children, instead of doing things that could help ordinary Palestinians. They have built an underground fortress, and most of those tunnels and most of the places where they pop out of are in hospitals, mosques, civilian neighborhoods. And Israel they had for a while this idea that we can feed the devil, right? That maybe Hamas is just interested in ruling the Gaza Strip, and so every once in a while we'll have skirmishes with them. But that wasn't true. They weren't interested in ruling the Gaza Strip. They were interested in making Israel think that that was their interest, and all the while they were preparing for this. And what you saw on October 7th, many Israelis believe is what would happen if Hamas were allowed to take over Israel. They would take out and shoot. And why would they do that? Why do we think that they would do that? Because that's what they say. That is what Hamas says in its charter. They're fighting an immoral enemy who doesn't want to live side by side. They want to kill us. And I'm not saying this about Palestinians. I'm saying this about the murderous Hamas leadership and organization and regime. And as you hear, and to come back to the point that I was making before, what Israel has to be now are not dead Jews, but live Jews. Jews who defend themselves. And the world honestly doesn't like that. There's a lot less taste for Jews who are living and who will defend themselves and who will have a place of our own and who will do exactly the same thing as every other country in the world would do. And if you're interested in testing out what should Israel do? And by President Biden, Donna told me I should be a little political today, so take this for whatever it's worth. I believe that he's been. I could not ask for more of an American president, and he raised an important question, which is Israel has to think about what comes the day after. And the answer is nobody knows what comes the day after, but Israel has made a choice. We prefer the chaos of what will come after to the status quo of Hamas existing. We're done with that. We're done with that. Because we literally cannot imagine anything more horrific or more evil or worse. And so Israel will be live Jews. We will do this. We are heading into chaos. And there is a lot to pray about. I'll say a couple of other things, and then I guess I'll take some questions. But number one, just to come back to the end of the service, it was so meaningful for those people, for those religious leaders to be there. And what so many of us need is for people to see us in our Jewishness, which not for every Jew, but for most Jews around the world involves a desperate and personal love and connection with what happens in Israel. And ask yourself, I'll tell you a quick story. I did a session with a group of teenagers at Jordan High School. There's a Jewish Student Association. And I was talking with them, and I just did this, we all do these little thought experiments in our heads. Mine was, what would happen if I wrapped myself in an Israeli flag with a sign that said, "I'm a rabbi, come talk to me." And I took a folding chair and I sat down in the middle of the city plaza in Durham. Would I feel safe? And the answer is I don't know. I don't know. And it's not my style. I'm not, I am speaking, by the way, there is a rally in Raleigh at 12:30. And the rally is release the hostages. And if we can't get behind that, I don't know what to, I don't have anything, I don't know what to do. Okay, release the hostages. And by the way, there are people in our community, I'll just say, with a lot closer ties than you know. In this community, in this room, to people who are being held hostage right now. And there are people all over this community. So I did this thought experiment with the kids. And I said to them, I'm just curious. I was improvising. I said, I am just curious how many of you would feel safe doing that, taking a folding chair, Israeli flag, little poster, I'm Jewish, come talk to me, and putting that at the entrance of your high school. There are 25 Jewish kids there, not one raised their hand. Not one. We need people to understand that there's an entire generation of Jewish children who don't feel safe unless they rinse themselves of a key aspect of their identity. Because it's politics. And I have sat with Jewish children, young adults, who have said to me that for the first time in their lives, they have felt physically unsafe being Jewish. One boy he got off at the subway stop in Chicago, and he said to himself, I'm really glad that I'm not wearing my Jewish star right now. And then he felt guilty because he said that to himself. There are kids who have seen things on the internet and heard things said, and they have been physically shaking with anger. And what we need is to be seen as Jews, many of whom love the state of Israel and for whom the state of Israel is desperately important, and who right now are worried not only about the 300,000 soldiers who've been called up and about the so many Israeli soldiers who are going to die, and the many, many Palestinian civilians who are going to die. And it is a desperate tragedy, and people are going to blame Israel. And the moral responsibility for the death of those civilians lies with Hamas. And if you think that you have a better answer to a ground invasion, use the following litmus test to evaluate your solution. Would I and my family go live in Kibbutz Be'eri tomorrow? And if you won't do that, then it's not an answer. Because what you're saying is that Jews shouldn't have a right to live in safety and security within 1948 Green Line Israel. And so any answer has to pass that litmus test. And I'll finish with one final thing. One of my teachers, Micha Goodman, is challenging the American Jewish community. And I just want to say maybe it should challenge all of us. Jewish, not Jewish, it should challenge us. He said there's a thing in the Jewish tradition called a neder. A neder is a vow. And it's something that obligates you. It's a statement that you make now that obligates you in the future. And the purpose of a neder is, the reason that you take one is that the present is fleeting. We all have feelings in the present, and feelings, they fleet and they go away. And we have experiences of the present, but we forget. And the neder exists in order to obligate you to remember how you feel in the present. And his challenge, he said, what Israelis need, I'll say it as spicily as he does. He says, if you're giving us consolations now, but you're going to not be with us when we defend ourselves, keep them to yourselves. What we need is in 2 to 4 weeks or 2 to 4 months, as Israel has to wage a horrific, I am not naive about this. Israel will wage a horrific campaign because it is fighting a horrific enemy. And because, as Joe Biden said, Golda Meir said to him, we don't have any other place to go. And Israel is going to need for people to be with it the way that we understand now. And there's a piece of that that feels uncomfortable to me. I don't want to write a blank check for Israel to commit war crimes. But I believe we need to remember that proportionality, we need to teach ourselves these things, that proportionality in international law does not correspond to the number of people killed. It corresponds to the military advantage that you gain through a particular strike. And we need to remember that Israel is fighting an immoral enemy. And how to do that, if you have better solutions, I'm all ears. Not that I have anything to do about it. But that's the reality of where we are. And if we're lucky, if we are lucky, this will stay contained in Gaza. There is a reasonable possibility, because it's already simmering, that Hezbollah will enter the game from the north. And there is a reasonable possibility that if Hezbollah enters the game from the north, that the United States and Israel will then need to bomb Iran. Because all of this, I am not a Middle East expert, but I'm going to go here and say all of this is, by the way, Jews, we like to say everything is about us. This is not actually about us. This is a part of a much, much bigger fight between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. And Shia Islam, Iran is pushing to make Shia Islam the hegemony, the dominant Islam in the world. And Saudi Arabia is fighting against that. And it's why a lot of people have said Israel's coming normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia may be what provoked this. And so there's a much bigger thing taking place here. And I don't have good answers, but we need to think about it. The last thing which I'll say, which is the most political thing that I probably have said, but I will tell you that specifically Valerie Fouchi in this district and just politicians everywhere. But I know that Valerie Fouchi's office has a lot of people in the district who are calling for a ceasefire and who are very angry at her for not being for being as supportive of Israel as she is. And I'm not telling you what position to take one way or another. You can probably guess what it is, but I just encourage the one thing that all of us can do, in addition to sending donations. Those of you from Bethel know that Bethel has decided to raise money to fund an ambulance. What can be the matter with an ambulance? Okay, the hijackers the terrorists hijacked 2 ambulances, and believe me, they're not using them for ambulances. Okay, so we're raising money. We're at about $80,000 of the way to $115,000. You can give money to that project, and you can be involved politically the way that we all can, and we should be grateful that we live here and have the ability to do that. So I've talked for a long time. Let me stop. I apologize that that this is so difficult. I also, of course, could not talk about anything else, and want to hear from you. Please either sort of your experience of the past 10 to 12 days or questions that you may have for me. We'll do that for I don't know, a little more time. Natalie. So for those on Zoom, Natalie's question was, as expert as Israel's security was, don't you think they knew that something was about to happen? From what I've read, and I think from what I've read, there were some indications, but they were not listened to. There was a lot that we didn't know. In other words, our assumptions, part of what happens when you do this is that you develop theories about things, and then reality confirms your theories, and so you don't think about what else reality could mean. So the theory for the past many years of the Netanyahu, but also the security establishment, was that Hamas was interested in sort of getting money from Qatar. They sort of arranged for the suitcases full of money to go and fund its organization. And as long as they were being paid off and sort of had the money to pay their apparatus and to run Gaza, that they were happy. And so there were all of these training exercises with paragliders and other things that the Israelis saw and knew were happening. And even some of the guards, from what I read, who were stationed on the lookout posts, noticed themselves being watched, right? But the Israelis said, we see it, but we think it's still fine. And by the way, I'm going to throw one other thing out there that's not yet getting a lot of press, but what's very, very clear. Another question you can ask is, because what we now know is that they had incredibly detailed information, not just maps, but information on how many guards are here and how many people are over there, and where and all of this stuff, not only about the maps that you could get from Google Maps or maybe downloading something from the internet about the kibbutz, but about the activity of the kibbutz. And you know where they got it? For the last several months, I think 6 months, I could be wrong, there were 20,000 workers in Gaza who the Israeli government was letting in so that they could make a living, because the world said to Israel, you have to let the people of Gaza work. And Israel was planning to increase that number out of humanitarian concerns. And among those 20,000 people were people who Hamas had casing the kibbutzim. What do you do? How do you fight a terrorist organization that will sabotage suppose it was 100 people of the 20,000. They are willing to sabotage the livelihoods of 19,900 people in order to get 100 people in there in order to commit terrorist atrocities. They don't care. Hamas does not care about innocent civilians. They do not care about the Palestinian people. And part of what we may be doing is part of the chaos that lies in front of us that is perhaps naively hopeful, but is we may be freeing Hamas, freeing the Palestinian people from their own oppressors. And those who are calling for a ceasefire should think about the Palestinian civilians who will be left under the rule of Hamas. And I'll just remind you of it because we need to be reminded. Israel left. We left. Horrible, horrible divisions in Israeli society. People crying Jew against Jew, ripping people out of their homes that they had lived in since 1967. And Israel, Ariel Sharon, hey, not exactly a peacenik, right? Said, we need to get out of here. And Jews fought what thank God didn't end up being a civil war, but a very traumatic summer of 2005 to rip up those settlements and leave. And Hamas is not the rightful ruler. The Palestinian Authority was supposed to be there, and it was a coup against the Palestinian Authority. Hamas shot them all brutally and kicked them out. And Israel imposed a blockade when Hamas started shooting missiles and said, we can't allow the free access of weapons into this place. And one more thing, it's an open air prison. What's the matter with the Israelis? There's a border with Egypt. And you know who won't take any Egyptian refugees, any Palestinian refugees? Egypt. Sisi has said no. And the Arab world, is anybody raising their hand in the Arab world and saying, we care about Palestinians, let them come to us? Nope. Why is it Israel's responsibility? The Palestinians must be freed from their oppressors. And it's Israeli soldiers who are going to die walking into a labyrinth of booby traps and their 200 hostages. Other questions? Norma?
I think the question I want to say. One, it would be great at Northern High School when you spoke to the Jewish students if they had invited other students as well. Because what I think for me, what has been the most difficult and hurtful is that, you know, I know a lot of Jewish people, but I know a lot of people who aren't Jewish, who know that I am connected with Israel, know that this means a lot to me. And only one person in my community where I live called me and said, how are you? I know how hard this is.
So let me repeat this for people on Zoom. What Norma talked about is, you know, could we have the kids at Jordan High School invite their peers, and that isolation of sort of, you know, has anybody asked me about this? And I want to say two things about that. Number one, quite beautifully, there were non-Jewish friends who came to the Jewish and who were there. I do think that the Jewish student, they just needed a place to meet amongst themselves. And I think that I think there is this sense of isolation. I also think that we as and I recognize that not everybody here is Jewish, and I want to say that we as that the Jewish community has a responsibility to take a deep breath and to sort of, and I'm sure you are doing this, so I'm not saying this out of any but to differentiate. I went to the barber, I got a haircut at Sport Clips, and the woman, as happens, asked me, "How are you?" I said, "It's been a really difficult." "Oh, why?" "Well, I'm Jewish. I'm actually the rabbi, and all this stuff that's been going on in Israel." And she said, "What's been happening in Israel?" Right? And there's a piece of me that was like, right? But there's a piece of me that said, "Look, some people, it's just not on the radar, right? And they don't mean to be mean, right? They're not. That's not vicious. That's just, people. There's a lot going on in everybody's lives." So we talked about it, and she was incredibly nice, and so I think we have an obligation. I don't know about an obligation, but in terms of our relationships, right? I think that we're best served with patience and with curiosity, and also just sort of making ourselves vulnerable. By the way, not to everybody. We can't do this with everybody, but with our close friends, to say, I probably don't talk about this very much, but I know that I'm Jewish, and actually this has been a really, really painful week for me. And I'm just wondering if, I would love to talk about it. Yeah.
And this is not meant in any way to negate or criticize anything you said today. But we have some very close relatives in Israel, live in Tel Aviv. One person lived in a divorce down the south. Part of the was not affected, but certainly everybody there was affected. They had to, evacuate their divorce. But for the last year or more, when they have been struggling with the judicial reform, and all of these people that we know were out there protesting, and there is a great amount of anger at Netanyahu and his government, and there's a lot of stuff that's coming up on England. It's like that is a piece of what was going on that may have affected why there weren't people in the South to help the South. There was no army. It took 20 hours for somebody to get there. And people are really angry.
So, and just to summarize on Zoom, there's a lot of anger within Israeli society about the failure of the government. And by the way, I was up last night. I did a session with a group in Los Angeles that started at 7:30 their time. From 10:30 to 11:30. So a rabbi needs as much caffeine as he can get. But I was talking about this with someone in a session, and an important thing, when I say that people experienced it as a pogrom, right? Part of that was the type of violence, but part of that was the lack of the state response, right? And part of what has been devastating about this was the absence of the army in that moment, the absence of the army for 24 hours. By the way, if you look at Times of Israel, which I commend to you as basically the best ongoing English language resource for what's happening, there were, the army chief has said we still can't guarantee that there are not Hamas terrorists inside of Israel, right? There was 20 hours when there was 2,000 terrorists running around Israel. We don't know that some of them may have driven up to Hebron or driven up to, to lots of places, right? And be waiting. And so there's a tremendous sense of anger at the government. And there's been a lot made of how Israel, the huge and overwhelming response, by the way, in terms of the reservists being called up, it's not mathematically possible, but 150% of reservists called up, showed up. Israel put out a call for reservists, and with an expectation that like 80, or if you want 80%, right, then you ask for 100%, and then you get your 80%. And there were plane loads of Israelis flying back under no obligation except a feeling of love and commitment to each other. And it's actually been the protest movement has done most of the organizing around supporting. And the government, this government has been an absolute disaster. It's now a war government where Gantz is in the government, but that feeling of abandonment has absolutely been part of this story. There were other hands, Martha. And then...
I have many close friends and cousins in Israel who have 5 of their grandchildren are now active in the union. So my feelings about Israel have been enormous, and I'm not sleeping at night, but I have to for a minute, because it occurred to me when you told the story about Jewish kids who don't want to wear a star or a kippah. What's going to happen in this country? Word is that on social media, the neo-Nazis and other groups like that are suggesting violence against Jews in this country. We're going to take down our business. We can be identified.
Right. Look, so
We never need a policeman outside.
right. So the question was about sort of the vulnerability of the American Jewish community. And one of the kids last Friday, some ex-Hamas leader or something like that called for a day of rage. And it wasn't a day of rage against Israel. It was a day of rage against Jews all over the world. And one of the kids said, "Are you sure it's a good idea for us to have a meeting of Jewish kids at a public high school?" And I said, "We'll be fine. Okay. We're not going to hide." And I also want to say, yes, we need a police presence. We need police at the synagogue now. I walk through this community with a kippah, and I'm not going to stop. And something that's very important is we have friends, we have allies, we have people who care. And we need to lean into those relationships. And we have those relationships not for strategic purposes. They're not utilitarian relationships. Thank God there are people who love and care about the Jewish community, and they care about Jews not as, as an issue, but they know and love you, and they care about you, and they care about me, and it's a different narrative that can also be true, and it can be true here in ways that it can't be true certainly in Israel, and that it can't be true in Europe and other parts of the world. And this is why, the last thing I'll say about that is, this is why the rule of law is so desperately important to the American Jewish community. And it's why the undermining of the judicial system and policing is so dangerous for the stability of the American democracy. Okay? We cannot have our judicial systems, our police forces undermined in their authority. They need to use their authority justly and judicially, but that is the difference between chaos. I'll tell you a quick story because I'm a rabbi, and then I'll take the next question. So this week's Torah portion, we're reading Parshat Noah. We're reading about Noah and the flood. And the Torah says that the world was filled with, get the irony here, it was filled with Hamas. I kid you not. Hamas in Arabic is an acronym for, I don't know what it stands for, but that's where the name, so there's no relation whatsoever, right? But the Hebrew word Hamas means violence and injustice or something like that. And so, but the truth is that it's not exactly clear. All we have in the Torah is that the world was filled with Hamas. And so the rabbis try to say, well, what was that, right? What was happening in the world that brought about the destruction of the world? And they tell a very weird story. They say what would happen is there was a law that said if you steal, and I'm just doing an example, if you steal $1 or more, then there's a penalty for it. Okay? But it has to be $1 or more. And so what people did is they went around and they stole 50 cents and 75 cents from each other. And the people who were getting victimized said, the hell, right? I'm being stolen, pardon my French, right? I'm being stolen from with impunity and the law won't protect me. And so they took matters into their own hands, and that's where the violence came from. Now the rabbis this was their subtle way of telling you that when the rule of law doesn't function, that's the border between violence and chaos and a civilized society. And so I spoke about this a number of years ago when the police officers were convicted after George Floyd. It was a very, very important moment because the Black community in this country had fundamental questions about whether or not police officers were above the law or not. In other words, and does the law work for the Black communities? Does it work for the African-American community? It was a very important moment, right? That people in this society need to know that the rule of law works to protect them. And the alternative is honor killings and vengeance and one against the other. And so we have to lean into those institutions. And we're very fortunate in Durham. The police chief, for those of you who get Bethel's newsletter, should have seen at the top a link to a letter that I received at the synagogue from Chief Davis, specifically saying, we are thinking about the Jewish community. We are here to protect you, and we are mourning with you. Right? I do not take that for granted at all. Yeah.
I want to make one point about something that you said at the beginning of your remarks that some may consider a minor point or truly a point, but I think it has important implications. From everything I've read, Israel has now withdrawn any claims about the beheading of children, of infants particularly. And I think where it's important is Israel's enemies and neutral observers are looking for any way to discredit what Israel says, as well as what they do. The last thing we want to do is give them opportunities to feel that Israel can't be believed. And I think we're seeing that with the bombing, so-called bombing of the hospital in Gaza. So given that, and Israel withdrew that because they haven't been able to verify. So I would just be really careful about, I mean, one doesn't have to talk about that and recognize the horrific things that were done by Hamas that have been verified. I actually have seen pictures on TV of Israeli babies' bodies riddled with bullets. But I would just say,
do me a favor. So I appreciate that correction. I'm very, very committed to facts, and but do me a favor, you have my information, send me the article or whatever, because I had not heard that, and I appreciate the correction. Yeah. Let me repeat what was said, that Israel apparently has withdrawn claims that children were beheaded. There's plenty of evidence of them being murdered in their beds, riddled with bullets, etc., but specifically the beheading of children. I thought that was what had happened at Be'eri, but it's very important to get the information right. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
Well, I think what you're saying is incredible developments. This is like a complex situation. There's so much information coming out, and we have a huge problem in our world. What is real and what is disinformation? And I think that's one of the things that's so concerning. You know, there's so much stuff floating around. People are hearing all kinds of different things. It's a real problem.
So, and Evelyn asked, you know, hey, how do you find out what's real? And this is where I'm probably more old school, but I do think that Times of Israel is a very, I know the editor, and he's very solid journalistically, and something that's important. So those of you, you may look for an article, it was written probably 10 years ago now by someone named Mati Friedman. Mati Friedman used to write for the New York Times, and he left the New York Times and he wrote a 30-page piece about the deep systemic problems of Western reporting on Israel. And I commend the piece to you. And so it does lead me to be distrustful of even, you know, many of, you know, the time. I mean, I still get the Times and, you know, Wall Street Journal and these things, but one of the things that you have to be sure of is, you know, number one, journalistic standards, right? In other words, it's not somebody's blog, it's not somebody's this and that. But number two, what Mati pointed out is there are a lot of people who don't speak the language and who are being taken for the grand tour. And by the way, the other thing which I want to say is, and this happened with the explosion at the hospital, is the journalists have a responsibility. You know, I don't think it's journalists. I'm not a journalism professor or anything, but to me, I can't imagine that it meets journalistic standards to say, just to report, well, Hamas said this. I mean, it may be journalistically accurate that Hamas said that, but if they will say whatever. Right. And so when you say, well, they're saying this, I can say the pigs fly, but you shouldn't report it because there's no factual basis for it whatsoever. Right. And part of what happened over the past day or two with the explosion in the hospital is that 15 minutes after the explosion, Hamas was blaming it on an Israeli airstrike. They have no way of knowing that. And the world journalism, the journalists who reported that committed, I don't know about sin, but they violated journalistic standards. You can't just say, well, Hamas said it, right? They can say anything. The question is, upon what basis do they have a basis for saying what they do? And if they don't, then you can't give it credibility. Right. And so you have to be good curators of information. And again, that's that question of how do you fight an immoral enemy? How do you report, right, on with a quote unquote government that doesn't have any commitment to these basic ideas. Krisha?
So I try to stick to the news sources that you recommended. Sometimes when my husband and my teenager go to bed, I flip around the Google channels with it. And I caught some CBS, and I know that I can watch this and have context, but other people watching it don't have the context. And one of the things that CBS News, they were showing war footage. And they had a tally in front of it, like a football game, that showed a death count of Israelis, of Israel versus Gaza, showing how one side was so much more than the other. And no matter what the journalists were saying, that was the image that was.
Mhm.
So I have friends, Jewish and not Jewish, who then refer to that
Right. And
and say, how can it, like,
and and the answer is, and it's not a great answer because I'm not talking about your friends, but I just think in general people have trouble holding complexity. Is number one, there is a difference. And last week was Breshit, was the story of Genesis, and God creates by making differences, putting the water here and the land here and the light here and the dark there. The very forces of goodness are about making distinctions, not chaos, right? Not blurring everything together. And there's a difference between Hamas purposefully targeting civilians, purposefully going and finding with the purpose of killing as many innocent people as possible and kidnapping as many people as possible. And when Israel bombs Gaza and civilians are killed as part of a military operation. And Israel is not targeting civilians, but Hamas is using civilians as human shields. They bombed the routes south, right, towards these humanitarian corridors because they're bullying their own people into staying so that they can be used for human shields. And ultimately, I think the push, one sort of line of pushback is to say Hamas is responsible. Hamas is responsible. It is simplistic. It's naive, it's simplistic, and it's morally unfair and wrong to say that because Israel bombs Gaza, that Israel is responsible for those deaths. Israel did not start this war, but it is a war. And you know what? It can all be over. It can be over tomorrow. You know how it can be over? Hamas can surrender. Now you laugh, and it's not going to happen, but they have agency. And people, one of the ways that Israel and Jews get demonized is that what we are told is Jews have all the power. We have a vast advantage. We have all the power. And so all of a sudden, Jews are responsible and Israel is responsible for all of the suffering. That's making a demon of Jews. Hamas has agency. We're not talking about a liberation movement that's interested in a two-state solution. They're not interested. They have agency. They can surrender and spare 2 million civilians in Gaza. They can spare everybody by just surrendering and let the people of Gaza have a different leadership. And they are willing to kill and let be killed, and they want to be killed. Their strategy is to get as many civilians killed as possible. And Hamas has responsibility. And I do not believe that Israel has a responsibility to prevent as many deaths as it can of civilians, but it also has a responsibility to protect the people who live on the other side of the border fence, because it's ours. It's ours because that's the Jewish story, but it's also ours because that's what the United Nations decided. And like every other people in the world, Jews get to have a home. We get to have a home of our own. I want to just say thank you to everybody online. I hope you were able to connect with as much of this as possible. I'm going to turn off the live streaming. Thank you. Thank you.